My daughter, you are so beautiful. Mother, I am sure you were more beautiful when you were younger.
Stand up and show me how you will dance on the day of your marriage ceremony.
Mother, you have to teach me more. You are the great stepper. People of Eke village, help! Help! My mother is burning.
In the town of Eke, where the soil held the warmth of the sun long after dusk, and the wind carried whispers between compounds, as though it remembered every story ever told, there lived a girl whose presence quietly unsettled the natural rhythm of life. Her name was Zara, and from the moment she was old enough to be noticed, people did not simply look at her, they paused because of her. It was never loud, never dramatic, but always there, that subtle shift in atmosphere whenever she entered a space, as though something unseen had followed her in and asked the world to pay attention. Conversations would soften without reason, laughter would dim slightly, and even those who had no intention of staring would find themselves looking twice. Not out of curiosity alone, but out of something deeper they could not explain. Zara grew up inside that attention without fully understanding it, accepting it the way a child accepts sunlight or rain, as something that simply existed without needing explanation. To her, it was normal that older women would study her face for longer than necessary, that visiting traders would linger near her home under the pretense of business, or that strangers would ask quiet questions about her, as though trying to understand something that could not be easily spoken. But in Eke, nothing that stood apart was ever without meaning, and though Zara did not yet know it, her existence had already begun to carry a weight far beyond her understanding. Inside her home, away from the watchful eyes of the village, life followed a quieter rhythm, one shaped not by admiration, but by routine and resilience. Her mother, Ezinne, was a woman whose strength did not need to be announced. She moved with a steady grace, spoke with careful intention, and carried herself in a way that made people trust her without knowing why. There was a calmness about her, the kind that did not come from ease, but from experience, from having faced life as it was, and choosing to endure it without losing herself. For many years, that strength remained untouched, forming the foundation of their small, quiet home. Zara knew her mother as someone dependable, someone constant, someone who could not be easily shaken by anything life presented. But change rarely announces itself when it first arrives, and what began as something small slowly grew into something impossible to ignore. At first, it was only moments, brief, almost invisible pauses that could be dismissed if one did not look too closely. Ezinne would stop in the middle of a task, her hand resting against the surface as though grounding herself, her breathing just slightly heavier than it should have been. Then the moments began to repeat, turning into patterns that stretched across days, then weeks. Fatigue followed her more closely than before, not the kind that comes from work and leaves with rest, but something deeper, something that lingered even after long hours of sleep. Zara noticed, though she did not immediately understand what she was seeing. As a child, she accepted her mother's quiet reassurances, the gentle insistence that everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. Outside their home, Zara's presence continued to grow in a way that could not be contained. What had once been quiet observation became open admiration, and what had once been curiosity became fascination. People began to speak of her beauty not as something ordinary, but as something unusual, something that did not quite belong within the limits of everyday life. They compared her to things that were not entirely human, to stories passed down through generations, to spirits and legends that lived in memory more than in reality. Zara heard fragments of these conversations, never enough to form a complete picture, but enough to feel that something about her was being discussed in ways she could not control. Still, she continued to live as she always had, helping her mother, moving through the village, speaking when spoken to, trying to remain within the boundaries of normal life, even as those boundaries slowly shifted around her. But as time passed, something else began to reveal itself, something that would not remain hidden no matter how much she wished it would. It began as a feeling, a quiet discomfort that followed certain days more than others. Days when the village was more alive than usual, when gatherings filled the air with voices and movement. And those were the days when Ezinne suffered the most. Zara saw the way her mother's strength faded after long days filled with admiration directed at her. She noticed how nights became heavier, how breathing became more difficult, how silence settled into their home, not as peace, but as something tense and fragile. The connection was not immediate, but it was consistent, and consistency has a way of turning suspicion into understanding. The realization settled in her slowly but firmly. The more people admired her, the weaker her mother became. By the time Zara approached the edge of adulthood, the quiet understanding she carried had turned into something heavier, something that pressed against her thoughts and refused to be ignored. And still, life moved forward, bringing with it moments that could not be avoided. The day those changes began did not arrive with warning. It came like any other, wrapped in the familiar rhythm of morning, carrying no sign of what was about to unfold. But by midday, the quiet balance that Zara had tried so carefully to maintain would be broken in a way that could never be undone. Because that was the day the messengers arrived. The day the messengers arrived in Eke did not begin like a day that would change anything. The morning carried its usual calm, but by midday, the rhythm shifted. The arrival of the royal messengers was not loud, yet it commanded attention. They moved with certainty, dressed in fine garments that reflected authority rather than decoration. And when they spoke, it was with clarity that made silence feel like the only proper response. They did not ask questions. They did not negotiate. They simply announced that Prince Obinna had chosen Zara of Eke. The word settled over the village like a sudden weight, and almost immediately, the atmosphere transformed. Joy spread quickly, as though the village had been waiting for permission to celebrate. People gathered, voices rising in excitement, disbelief, and pride. To them, this was elevation. It was recognition. It was the kind of moment that would be remembered. But while the village celebrated, something else happened quietly inside Zara's home. Ezinne collapsed. There was no gradual warning, no slow decline. One moment she was standing, and the next, her body gave way as though something unseen had suddenly been removed from her strength. Zara was at her side instantly, calling her name, but her mother's eyes no longer carried the same clarity. It was as though something essential had been taken from her. Confusion spread, then fear. The celebration outside faded into silence as concern replaced excitement. It did not take long before someone suggested calling for help, And when the spiritual guide arrived, the atmosphere shifted again. He observed first, quietly, as though reading something beneath the surface. When he spoke, his voice carried certainty. He explained that there was a bond between mother and daughter, a connection that fed on admiration, a bond that drew strength from attention. As he spoke, the truth began to take shape. Zara's beauty, the constant admiration, the attention that followed her everywhere, it was not without consequence. Every word spoken in admiration, every gaze, every moment of focus was tied to her mother's strength. The realization settled heavily. Zara stood still as memories began to align in her mind. Moments of admiration followed by her mother's decline. Days of attention followed by nights of weakness. The pattern was undeniable. The spiritual guide's words became final. If nothing changed, her mother would not survive. The only way to break the bond was to refuse what sustained it. That night, silence filled Zara's thoughts more than sleep ever could. The next day, the village gathered once again. The atmosphere was different now, expectant, certain. The king sat with composed authority, and Prince Obinna stood beside him, calm, as though waiting for a moment already decided. Zara stepped forward into the center of the gathering, and for the first time, she did not feel admiration in the same way. It felt like pressure instead. When she spoke, her voice did not shake. She said she could not accept the marriage. The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Confusion spread immediately. This was not what they had expected. But Zara continued, explaining not in detail, but in decision, that she could not accept a future built on something that weakened her mother. Silence deepened as her meaning settled in. Then, in a moment that changed everything, she reached for her hair. It was deliberate. The same feature that had drawn admiration was cut away without hesitation. The sound was small, but the meaning was immense. Something shifted in the silence that followed. The connection broke. When Zara returned home, the change was immediate. Ezinne, who had been weakened beyond explanation, was sitting upright. Her strength had returned, as though something heavy had been lifted from her completely. Her breathing was steady again, her presence grounded. There were no words strong enough to capture what had happened. Some truths do not require explanation once they are seen. The bond had broken. The consequence had ended. In the days that followed, Prince Obinna visited. He did not come with anger or disappointment. Instead, he came with understanding. He acknowledged her decision, not as rejection, but as clarity. He recognized that she had chosen something greater than expectation, greater than admiration, greater than status. Zara remained in Eke, but she was no longer defined by the attention she once carried. She no longer moved as someone being watched, but as someone who had chosen her own path, regardless of how it appeared to others. In that choice, she became something different. Not a symbol of beauty, not an object of admiration, but a reminder that even the most celebrated things in life carry weight, and that sometimes the greatest strength is not acceptance, but refusal. In the end, what remained was not what she had been given, but what she had chosen to let go.